Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here for our final Visiting Faculty Scholars of Color talk for the school year. It has been a terrific year of really great speakers and scholars, and I'm sure that today is no different. Some of you may know that this series is a collaboration between the Dean's Office and the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education. The series itself dates back more than 25 years and includes an extraordinary roster of really famous, very influential, incredibly smart people who've made extraordinary contributions to education in all sorts of ways. Again, I'm certain that today will be no different. It is my pleasure to welcome Maisha Winn here to Penn. She is the Susan Cellmer Endowed Chair in English Education, and she's a professor in Language and Literacy in the Story Curriculum and Instruction Department at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before joining the Wisconsin faculty, she did a postdoc at Teachers College, Columbia University, and she was an associate professor with tenure at Emory University in their Department of Educational Studies. Certainly, Wisconsin was very, very lucky to have gotten a scholar of Professor Winn's caliber. She is a previous recipient of the AERA Early Career Award, which is not easy to get. More recently, she's gotten a really big distinguished award from the W.T. Grant Foundation and is spending the year working on a project associated with that. And although she teaches in Wisconsin, she's spending a lot of time in California doing that work. So here's just a really quick story. I was so apologetic yesterday when Maisha and I spoke on the phone about the 8:30 start time. And because she's coming from the West Coast, and I thought, geez, you know, it's going to be 5:30 her time. And she asked, will I have enough time to work out? I think it's just so impressive. Her work has been published in Harvard Educational Review, the Review of Research in Education, the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, and Research in the Teaching of English. Her books are numerous. Some of them include Girl Time, Literacy, Justice, and the School to Prison Pipeline, which was published by Teachers College Press. And she has another book with Django Paris, who was here earlier this year as part of this series, Humanizing Research, Decolonizing Qualitative Inquiry with Youth and Communities, which is this year's recipient of the AERA Outstanding Book Award from the Qualitative Research SIG. Maisha's she's really great. She's really extraordinary. Her bachelor's degree is from UC Davis. She has a master's from Stanford, and her PhD is from Berkeley. She'll be talking today about restorative teacher education in the time of mass incarceration. Maisha Winn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I do have to say this. A lot of people assume that Shaun Harper and I are BFFs, and this is our first time actually meeting, but we have hit it off immediately, and I want to thank you, Dr. Harper, for being such a gracious host. Thank you, Dean Grossman, for having me. Your work is obviously very, very important to me as an English educator and a literacy scholar. I want to thank Miss Diana, who I don't think she's in here anymore. She's gone? Oh, well, I want to thank her because she helped me get sorted out. She is the reason why I'm actually physically here. And I want to thank Miss Melissa, who was gracious enough to help me get sorted out as well. Thank you for everything. And Mr. Charles, who said he liked my dress, but he was going to have to ruin it with the microphone. And I'm okay with that. So thank you. I am going to begin I'm going to begin my paper with a few belief statements, in sort of a non-traditional way that help you understand where I'm coming from in terms of my work and the way that I'm thinking about the world these days that I think are really important to frame this talk today. America should dismantle all jails for children, cease housing children in adult facilities, and invest in providing a robust early childhood education that is accessible to all families. Teacher education needs to address mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, and the school-prison nexus explicitly in the training of teachers. English teachers in particular work with a powerful set of mediating tools, literature, poetry, prose, plays, writing, speaking, discussion, debate, that have the potential to disrupt racist, classist, and sexist thinking that sort, label, and consequently isolate particular children. Teachers must resist colonizing pedagogies that privilege particular texts, ways of being and knowing that isolate youth. Teachers must be prepared to historicize their lives and the lives of the children in their classrooms. And teachers have the power to engage in what I refer to as a restorative teacher education that seeks to reclaim the notion of the peaceable classroom. I begin with this set of belief statements because I've come to a place in my program of research and journey as a teacher educator in the United States where I can no longer feign being unbiased, unmoved, and untouched by mass incarceration in the United States. The purpose of this talk today is to identify pedagogical stances that seek to disentangle literacy learning with jails, prisons, isolation, and other forms of punishment by focusing on what it would mean to prepare teachers, especially English teachers, to use their work in the classroom to reject efforts that sort, label, and remove particular children from school settings. More specifically, I argue for a restorative teacher education based on my work on a restorative English education that has the potential to support youth and their teachers in becoming civic actors in schools and beyond as they engage of acts of reading, writing, speaking, thinking, and doing. Oddly enough, when I first moved to Atlanta more than a decade ago, as an assistant professor, a newly minted assistant professor, I had an experience that has only recently come into focus. One day I was leaving a popular shopping center and searching for my car in a crowded parking lot. I was being followed by a crew of young African-American men who were selling their hip hop CD. While I was not really in the mood to have a conversation in the parking lot, I found it impossible to ignore this group of young people who shared their stories about racial profiling and struggles in education. However, I stopped in my tracks when they told me that they were from Wisconsin. "You have hip hop in Wisconsin?" I asked. They laughed and proceeded to tell me all about racism and classism in their native Milwaukee. When all of us finally found my car, one young man put their CD in my hands and said how much he appreciated the fact that I listened and asked questions. Relieved to find my car after being trailed by other cars looking for the highly coveted parking spaces, I thanked the young men profusely, feeling badly that they would not let me compensate them for their music. Later, when I had a quiet moment, I finally looked at the CD title, Wisconsequences, with con in all caps. I was amused by the wordplay and found it clever, and I wished I'd asked more questions. Little did I know that I would be moving to Wisconsin some 10 years after this chance encounter. Nor did I know that Wisconsin would be the most avid incarcerator of Black men. According to the Wisconsin Mass Incarceration of African American Males Workforce Challenges for 2013 report, conducted by the Employment and Training Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Wisconsin had the highest incarceration rate for Black men in the United States, with more than half of the African American men in Milwaukee County alone in their 30s serving time in the state prison system. The authors argue that the increase in Wisconsin's prison population, which has tripled since 1990, was, quote, fueled by increased drug enforcement rather than treatment, and prison construction, 3 strikes rules, minimum sentence laws, truth in sentencing replacing judicial discretion in setting punishments, concentrated police in minority communities, and state incarceration for minor probation and supervision violations, end of quote. In Dane County, Milwaukee's so-called more progressive neighbor that houses the University of Wisconsin-Madison, disparities between Blacks and whites in the areas of criminal and juvenile justice and education are indicative of what's taking place throughout the United States. According to the Wisconsin Council on Children and Families report, Race to Equity, a baseline report on the state of racial disparities in Dane County, 21.3% of Black students were suspended in contrast to 2.3% of white students during the 2010-2011 academic year, in spite of the fact that Black students made up only 11.3% of the enrollment. They accounted for 48.9% of the total students suspended. During the same academic year, The rate per 1,000 Black students expelled for incidents unrelated to weapons or drugs was 451.6 per 1,000, as opposed to 29.9 per 1,000 for white students. In sum, Black students were 15.1 times more likely to be expelled than white students. Wisconsin failed Black children across several domains and was ranked last in the United States in areas such as children ages 3 to 5 enrolled in nursery school, preschool, or kindergarten, high school students graduating on time, or children who live in families with incomes that are above the 200% of poverty. And that's the Annie E. Casey race for results. Some of you may have seen in the news recently the life claimed by the Madison police, Tony Robinson, unarmed 19-year-old biracial African-American and white teenager. And Madison was just recently voted the happiest place to live in the country. Scholars have argued that the discipline gap or the targeting of particular youth for suspensions, both in and out of schools, and expulsions, as well as other forms of isolation, has contributed to what has been referred to as the achievement gap or the education debt, which is what I prefer, that America owes its Indigenous, Black, and Latino students and families. Now, while I have specific concerns about Wisconsin and Dane County in particular, where I conduct research and train English teachers, these disparities are part of a national dialogue. To be sure, the U.S. Department Office for Civil Rights released data that demonstrated racial disparities in school discipline policies across the country. In the data snapshot, the OCR revealed that Black students experience more suspensions and expulsions than any other ethnic group, even beginning as early as preschool. While education research has typically focused on Black male students, I have argued that Black girls are also vulnerable in the school prison nexus. OCR's snapshot demonstrated that Black girls are suspended and expelled more than any other race or ethnicity, as well as more than most boys. Most recently, Michelle Alexander's examination of mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness compares the over-incarceration of Black people in the 21st century to the new Jim Crow South. While building a case that America's preoccupation with incarceration is creating a new caste system, Alexander ultimately argues that addressing mass incarceration should be the new civil rights agenda in the United States. While there are scholars who have challenged the appropriateness of comparing mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex to America's tenuous history of Jim Crow laws, I encourage you to read James Foreman Jr.'s critique of the Jim Crow. I agree with Alexander's assertion that the fate of millions of people, indeed the future of the Black community itself, may depend on the willingness of those who care about racial justice to re-examine their basic assumptions about the role of criminal justice in our society, end of quote. While Alexander's work focuses mostly on Black males, I think it is important to note the global lockdown that girls and women are suffering. That is, Black and brown women on every single continent in this world are increasingly being held in captivity. Please see Julia Sudbury's work for that. Elsewhere, I assert that I am not the least bit interested in a gender war between Black boys and Black girls. I believe our narrow focus in education on Black boys does a disservice to the systematic policing of Black girls' voices, bodies, and ways of knowing and being that are often relegated in two contrasting categories, loudies or ladies. As a literacy scholar with one foot firmly planted in cultural historical activity theory and a teacher educator, I have found that many of the students who are earning certification to teach middle school and high school English are unaware of how mass incarceration, zero tolerance policies, and the overall policing of children and youth impact their students. These aspiring teachers are also unaware of the histories of their students' communities, as well as the historical underpinnings of the education debt America owes its children. Teachers also undermine their own historicized selves in favor of a normalized discourse of personal responsibility and academic success. But I'm not finger wagging. Elsewhere, I document my journey as a high school English teacher and my lack of understanding as to why some of my students would disappear for weeks or sometimes a month or two. Finally, one student told me what everyone except me seemed to know. Students were serving time in juvenile correctional facilities. I was shocked and totally unprepared to support them. Do I give them all the work they missed? Hold an after-school tutorial? Wait, do they know that I know? Am I supposed to know? Wouldn't they have told me if they wanted me to know? And how do you talk about jail with all the shame and longing that becomes a part of the discussion? One of the high school counselors, who I knew well and loved, he was my counselor when I attended this school, suggested that I not mention the J words. jail, juvenile detention center, etc. To students, yet the silence was killing all of us. Outside of an education law class that was very basic, I did not have anything in my teacher training that alluded to the fact that some of my students might be entangled in the juvenile justice or child welfare systems, and consequently would be missing classes, putting them farther and farther behind, academically and socially. As an equity-oriented teacher, I knew this was wrong, and that it felt bigger than I could wrap my mind and arms around at the time. It would not be until years later that I would develop a language and framework for thinking about literacy, education, and justice. For a decade, I have immersed myself in teaching and learning spaces committed to building what I call a lifetime circle for young people in their efforts to create and sustain literate identities with the guidance of those who I refer to as practitioners of the craft, or adult allies who embody the craft that they are teaching. So these are English teachers who are also readers and writers. These are math teachers who are engaged in math beyond the classroom. Throughout my program of research, I've conducted multi-sided ethnographies where I try to serve as a worthy witness to writing communities in which both youth and teachers used writing and performing writing to build and sustain literate identities in the classroom and beyond. Most recently, I've revisited my praxis as a literacy scholar with one foot firmly planted in English education to synthesize scholarship, policy, and practice in order to provide a pedagogical mapping, if you will, for pre-service middle school and high school English teachers in the age of mass incarceration. I just want to share a couple of pictures. This was from my work with the Power Writers. Some of you are familiar with Writing and Rhythm. It was published under my maiden name, Fisher, where I worked with a group of student poets in the Bronx at University Heights High School with a teacher who the students refer to as Papa Joe. And this was a class where students were encouraged to bring their original writing, give each other feedback through a process that they called read and feed. They were also encouraged to do things like catch words. These are all what I call Joeisms. The teacher's name is Joe. Catch words, become Jedis of language. This was their job in the class. It was a class that was 4 units at their high school. It met on Friday mornings, but then they also voluntarily met throughout New York City on Saturdays, and students also volunteered to meet on Wednesdays after school. And we took 4 of the Power Writing students to Mayaguez, Puerto Rico to actually do some of the work in vocational high schools in Mayaguez, and also to work with pre-service teachers at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayaguez. And even though at the time I wasn't thinking about restorative justice, it's really interesting to me that Papa Joe's class was always conducted in a circle, and it was always conducted with the sort of one mic culture, which is one person has the mic, that person is talking, everybody is listening and respecting. And I'll talk a little bit more about the restorative justice circle processes. And then when I started doing this work with the Girl Time program, which was a woman-focused theater company in the Southeast that taught playwriting and playmaking to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated girls. So the circle that you're seeing is actually their summer program. So girls who had been released from youth detention centers and who were on probation were invited to stage 10 plays written by their incarcerated peers. They were actually paid to participate in the summer program. And so the stage productions were also mixed with professional actors in the community. And so everything that we did, all of our activities, all of our thinking was done in the circle. Again, I was seeing these patterns, but I didn't have that restorative justice discourse. I didn't have that language. I didn't really know what to make of it beyond that this was a way of everybody connecting. But these were the structures of these spaces. These were the foundations of these spaces. I refer to this pedagogical stance as a restorative English education. And I initially defined restorative English education, this is a piece in Research in the Teaching of English in 2013, as a pedagogy of possibilities that employs literature and writing to seek justice and restore, or in some cases create, peace in classrooms and beyond. I'm expanding this definition to assert that restorative English education as a pedagogical stance toward literacy education in which English writing teachers commit to supporting all youth on their journey to becoming agentive civic actors in classroom communities and beyond. In a restorative English education classroom, English and writing teachers provide robust learning opportunities for youth to read widely and deeply and write for a variety of purposes using a historicized literacy. I'm borrowing that from Chris Gutierrez. I am challenging literacy scholars who are training the next generation of English teachers to explicitly demonstrate how the teaching of writing for a variety of purposes and using literature to engage issues around race, class, and gender and justice can keep children and youth in the classroom. While I focus on English education for the purpose of this study, I believe these efforts must be made across disciplines and domains in teacher education. I have a colleague, Anita Wager, who's doing work around social justice and math. Melissa Broughton is doing work on science and teacher education. And one of the things that's really interesting that Melissa Broughton is looking at is professional development for science teachers and also policies that unfortunately undermine any efforts to disassemble racial disparities in science teaching in schools. So policies such as we have too many students, so some of the students have to take physical science, even though it's not a college prep class, because we don't know what to do with these students. We know they don't deserve to be in physical science, they need to be in a higher class, but we just can't manage what we would do with this large population of students. So they don't get to progress in science the way a lot of their peers do. So she's examining that kind of work. Erica Walker, who's at Teachers College, who's doing work on Black mathematicians, is doing this work as well. I'm also challenging literacy scholars to revisit the question that drove Mary Rose O'Reilly to conceptualize the English and composition classroom as the quote-unquote peaceable classroom. O'Reilly's English professor, Ihab Hassan at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, posed the question, I wonder if it is possible to teach literature in a way that people stop killing each other. Lately, I have dared to imagine, how can I teach teachers to use the aforementioned powerful mediating tools in literacy classrooms to address this question? Through my work with pre-service teachers, my question has evolved into, how do we teach English in a way that eradicates the school-prison nexus and uses the tools found in English classrooms, poetry, prose, memoir, drama, writing for a variety of purposes, to facilitate a socio-critical literacy, or learning that keeps children present and motivates them to be civic actors. The conceptual and theoretical frameworks for restorative English education are informed by the intersectionality of restorative justice, critical literacy scholarship, and cultural historical activity theory. Borrowing from colleagues in legal studies who primarily work in juvenile and criminal justice contexts, restorative justice is an alternative response to harm that first seeks to change the discourse of crime and incarceration, as well as the practices favored in our current juvenile and criminal justice systems that have found their way into many of the schools through zero tolerance policies. I have a William T. Grant Distinguished Fellowship. I'm in Oakland, California at the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, working with a restorative justice program, and the lead restorative attorney, Sujatha Baliga, I love how she says, Howard Zare and the restorative justice movement, they have three very perfect questions, and they really form the theory of restorative justice. Who has been hurt? What are their needs? And whose obligations are these? Who has been hurt? What are their needs? And whose obligations are these? In restorative justice, words like crime and offense are often exchanged for harm. Trials or courts are replaced by consensus building. There's a lot of court diversion programs throughout the city of Oakland that NCCD has been working with to try to support youth who would have certain charges brought against them, have them go face to face with the person who they caused harm to see if they could work out, build consensus, and find something for them to do that would make the person who experienced the harm feel better about what happened and hold them accountable. Restorative justice insists that a community responds to harm in a way that invites the person experiencing the harm and the person causing the harm to be active participants in constructing a response to harm that results in change that everybody defines together. And this is not new. The work in restorative justice has been a part of our indigenous communities in Canada and throughout the United States. Howard Zare is primarily responsible for importing restorative justice in the Northern American context in terms of what we see now. I also really think it's important to look at the work in New Zealand. The Maori community has been very instrumental in getting New Zealand government to acknowledge restorative practices that come from their practices. And now the New Zealand government deals with all juvenile cases through a restorative process. They do not have juvenile detention centers anymore, okay? So it is possible. It is possible. In circles, participants identify the values that they need in place to work with each other. And these peacemaking or peacekeeping circles are one example of restorative justice practices. The other types of practices are the restorative case conferences, which are part of the court diversion program, but the restorative circles are used particularly in school contexts as support circles, conflict circles when there are two people who are struggling with each other or where harm has been caused, classroom community circles when a teacher is struggling with a class and needs an outside facilitator to support. The support circles are typically for one student. The student has advocates, either family members or mentors or some adult ally from someplace in their lives. And so the more people who are trained in the restorative justice practices at a school site, the better. It's really important to have certified and non-certified staff members trained because the students have relationships with lots of different adults in the building, and sometimes the non-certified staff are really, really key in those relationships. But I also think this quote by Fania Davis, attorney and founder of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, really encapsulates what RJ is about. Restorative justice is founded on a worldview that affirms our participation in a vast web of interrelatedness. It's that interrelatedness that is really key. The purpose of restorative justice is to repair the harm caused to the whole of the web, restoring relationships to move into a brighter future. Circle keepers, who in best cases are students, move restorative justice circle participants through a series of questions that seek to historicize and humanize lives while building a socio-critical literacy that views circle participants through a larger historical narrative of their families and their families' contributions to the world. In a restorative English education, the circle begins with, who are you? Why are you here? I ask teachers, why teach English? Why now? In my restorative English education circles, I ask participants to discuss life-changing pieces of literature they hope to put into the hands of young people in order to underscore the power of literature, widely construed, has to inspire dialogue around lived experiences. And throughout my program of research, I've tried to understand the role of youth performing or embodying original text. So you saw the poetry students and the playwrights, the youth playwrights, and how this practice might inform how they view themselves as readers, writers, thinkers, and also doers of the word. At the crossroads of literacy and youth justice in my multi-sided ethnography of Girl Time, a playwriting program for formerly incarcerated and incarcerated girls, I learned how youth were often trapped by language, especially words that label and sort and also disrupt opportunities for them to frame themselves as literate, capable, and deserving of robust learning opportunities to demonstrate their knowledge, skills, compassion, and empathy, the ways in which the Girl Time program provided. Most recently, I have asked how creating a discourse of restoration in classroom communities and schools informed by restorative justice practices might help school communities dismantle language mindsets and practices. I'm also interested in how the restorative justice circle processes or peacemaking or peacekeeping circles address harm while creating a forum for youth to share and exchange life stories. In restorative justice circles, questions that delve deeply into one's historicized self are used to incite dialogue and build consensus among people who may not otherwise have opportunities to engage each other. A cultural historical activity theory or CHAP framework informs the ways in which I've come to understand these practices in American school contexts, because culture is not singular or monolithic in these spaces, or as Gutierrez and Rogoff posit, cultural historical approaches, and in cultural historical approaches, cultural differences are attributed to variations in people's involvement in common practices of particular cultural communities, end of quote. And these practices reveal, to borrow from Mike Cole, that the structure of development of the human psychological processes emerge through participation in culturally mediated, historically developing, practical activity involving cultural practices and tools. Circle processes in restorative practices cultivate socio-critical literacies by offering agentive opportunities for students who experience or cause harm to build consensus and jointly decide what needs to happen. According to Gutierrez, a socio-critical literacy is a historicizing literacy that privileges and is contingent upon students' socio-historical lives, both proximally and distally. Here I argue that not only do circle processes used as a part of restorative practices in American school contexts invite youth and teachers to exchange lived experiences and narratives. But these circles also constitute a third space where tensions and contradictions are utilized to seek individual and collective transformation in the way youth view themselves and each other. I'm just wrapping up a Spencer-funded study looking at a case in the Midwest of a high school that is really known for their restorative practices. They have partnered with a nonprofit who has a restorative justice program to train students, to train teachers, and to train the administrators. Well, as you can imagine, the training for the teachers and the administrators has been very slow because to pull teachers out of their classrooms is hard, and to get administrators out of the building, the substitutes are even more expensive, and it's really hard to budget for that. So they have been very successful at training the students. And the students are the ones that the teachers and administrators actually call on to facilitate the circles. And it has created this really interesting culture in that they have not targeted students who were just the straight A students who were doing well. They have also invited and trained students who had struggles in classrooms, who actually in the past had faced referrals as well as suspensions. And they've been trained in the restorative justice practices, and so they are the circle keepers in the school, and that's who we call on there. What I think is also really interesting is in Madison schools in particular, we have youth court. I don't know if you have youth court in the schools in Philadelphia. So you do? Okay, so youth court really mirrors what we already have in terms of our criminal justice system. I mean, there's a juror, there's not really an official judge, but there is someone making a judgment, and there is a sentence. And so what's interesting to me is while restorative justice seeks to try to disband that kind of language, the youth court programs are still in the schools, and they live with the restorative justice programs. And what I'm finding is that I think for the adults in the building, the youth court is insurance in some ways for the restorative justice practices, which everyone hasn't bought into yet, but people feel okay about having it because you have this system that still really mirrors something that we understand, right? Having a judgment, you have a sentence, you have something that we give to you that is your, really essentially your punishment, and that you have to follow through on that. So it's really interesting to me that the schools are not willing to really do the restorative justice on its own. They don't want it on its own, but it coexists with the youth court. However, the student circle keepers who I've been interviewing, several of them have been doing work in the youth courts as well. And they've talked about the ways in which the restorative justice training informs the way they handle the cases in youth court. So for example, one of the students talked about sentencing a peer to actually participating in some sort of after-school club or activity. So that was the student's sentence, like to get involved, not to be isolated, not to have to, miss class, but part of the issue is that you're not engaged, you're not invested in this school community, you don't feel like there's anything here for you, so why would you be invested? So the sentences are things like being engaged, participating in this club, then we check back with you, and we find out how it's going. You have to give us a report, you have to talk us through. But this is in lieu of course, being suspended. The role of narratives, the narrative approach, I've been thinking a lot about the narrative approach in restorative justice circles. So I went through a narrative approach to restorative justice training in Northern Ireland. So in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and throughout Northern Ireland, they have also adopted restorative practices that are mandatory for every single youth who is brought up on any sort of charges. They have to have a mandatory restorative case conference. And in this conference, the youth can have their, an ally or someone who supports them, and then the community really comes together, whoever was, experienced the harm, to make a decision about what would be best for the youth. I mean, it's so important there that when I went to the European Forum for Restorative Justice conference, that their Minister of Justice actually came to the Restorative Justice conference. And the narrative approach, though, starts in a different place. It doesn't start with the actual incident. The narrative approach argues that when we start with the incident, we're limiting how we view the person who has caused harm and the person who has experienced harm. Because the incident is not the thing that defines people on either side, right? It's not the incident, it's not where your life started, that's not even how this problem started, but it's all of the things that we bring with us. And so this narrative approach I think is really, really interesting. And so I've been becoming more interested in the narrative approach and how it plays out in American school context. The role of narratives and family narratives in particular cannot be undermined. Scholars in psychology have examined the role of articulating family narratives in child and youth development. And most of those studies focus on white or middle-class children. However, restorative circle processes provide venues for youth to revisit and retell family narratives, including lessons learned, not learned, or waiting to be relearned. Embedded in these narratives are tools to respond to life's obstacles and opportunities for capacity building. So I'm arguing that in these circles, what I have seen in this case study is that these young people are rebuilding their family narratives in these spaces. Maybe it didn't happen at the dinner table, which is where a lot of these studies took place, bedtime story, ritual time, but they're rebuilding them in these circles. Ultimately, a restorative English education seeks to train teachers to use the circle and narrative approaches as a tool to support peer relationships around spoken and written texts that have the potential to build social boundary crossing networks. Central to my conceptualization of restorative English education is that literature transforms lives. It transforms lives, it gives us new vocabulary and a new way of seeing ourselves. Father and son children's literature authors Walter Dean Myers and Christopher Myers recently responded to a study conducted by the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee that claimed out of 3,200 children's books published in 2013, only 93 were about Black people. Walter Dean Myers shared his story of his love for reading as a child and the sudden rupture of this joy when he had a revelation, and I'm quoting him here, as I discovered who I was, a Black teenager in a white-dominated world, I saw that these characters and these lives were not mine, end of quote. This revelation led to his withdrawal from reading, from school, and learning, only to return much later after being inspired by the writing of James Baldwin, who wrote about Black people in Harlem, who looked and sounded like the people Myers knew and cared about. Myers' impetus, and I love he said, I didn't even really think this was like the best book I read, but I was just so excited that I recognized the people. It wasn't that was, the best book that I read, but I recognized the people, and that meant more to me. Myers' impetus for writing or becoming what he calls a landscape artist, committed to depicting, quote, scenes for inner city youth that are familiar, end of quote, was making inner city children, and I'm quoting him again, human in the eyes of readers, and especially in their own eyes, end of quote. When Walter Dean Myers conducted research for his young adult book, we know this book pretty well, Monster, he interviewed a white attorney who worked on defense cases for many poor clients. The attorney explained to Myers that the hardest part of his work was to humanize his clients in the eyes of the jury, to make them think of this defendant as a human being and not just one of them. The circle then is an opportunity to not only build consensus or build a community response to harm, but often it's the first time participants are seeing and hearing each other beyond these monolithic labels. And while the spaces I have encountered over the past decade always use circles both literally and figuratively, they did not strategically employ a restorative discourse. That is, language or practices explicitly used to support restorative justice in teaching and learning contexts. However, I have found that the values that are found in restorative justice, peacemaking, peacekeeping circles, such as consensus building and developing relationships, have lived in some of the most compelling teaching and learning spaces I've witnessed. When I had the chance to be a worthy witness in the power writing class that I mentioned at the University Heights High School, which was then located on the Bronx Community College campus, and they have since moved the building. The articles were really interesting. They moved the school actually really close to a juvenile detention center, and there was a huge uproar from the community, but it did not stop them moving the school right down the street from the detention center. In my work with the Power Writers, a collective of youth poets from the Bronx, the teacher, poet, and what I refer to, using Robin D.G. Kelly's words, as a freedom dreamer, Joseph Ubilace, or Papa Joe, explicitly discussed the goals of his writing class with his students, which included decolonizing the road to becoming literate for Black, American, West Indian, and Latino children. It was through my work with Papa Joe, as Papa Joe's co-teacher, that I learned what it means to think restoratively with students and to create a circle that students understood was always available to them. He did not want youth to make whiteness synonymous with education or being literate. Additionally, Papa Joe co-facilitated power writing circles with students at more resource schools where he found there was just as much need for students to have a circle to exchange writing and ideas as there were in under-resourced schools. And it's one of the things that I argue about in the restorative English education piece, that this is not just for particular youth. A lot of times people think that this is just for Black children, for Latino children, for poor children, for children who have experienced marginalization. But I would argue that the circle process is really for all youth. And in the case study that I'm doing now, all youth are involved in circles at some point. So I think it's really, really important to underscore that. Among some of the consistent messages, or what I coded as Joe-isms in my initial study, Papa Joe explained to his students, in America, all they want you to remember is your commitment number, referring to the culture of incarceration. Papa Joe routinely encouraged power writers to catch words, that is, stop to look up words, concepts, and references that sounded unfamiliar, to not walk past the description in the museum, in the herb garden at the cloisters, or on a plaque on a building on Columbia University's campus. This city belongs to you, Joe would explain to his students. Don't use the New York City Public Library as a kickstand. Go inside. My initial study of multi-sited ethnography began in 2003, and since then I've had the opportunity to conduct longitudinal study examining how power writing alumni continue to invoke the cultural practices of power writing, as well as how Papa Joe's teaching has changed over time now that his original students are no longer formally in his classroom. In 2009, 6 years after the initial study, Joe and 4 power writing alumni who were college students at the time went with me to the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, as I mentioned. And this is it was really interesting. I started becoming fascinated by the ways in which Joe, over these past 10 years, the way in which he introduced power writing and power writers to the public. And so I started collecting and analyzing all of these introductions. They were really interesting to me. So in one of the introductions, he described power writing. He said, we're presently housed in the famous New York Poets Cafe. It's now a nonprofit organization. It's a small poetry circle. We have approximately 40 students at any given time across 2 high schools. And I'll try to keep this brief. He said, I have 4 of my former students here who continue to be my students. It's a lifetime circle, and they would like to perform, and I would like to introduce you to them. And then when I asked him to talk a little bit more about this notion of a lifetime circle, he said, Maisha, I really want to say this to you. I feel the desire to learn and to expose my students to culture and to the culture. And I believe that the process of life in a stratified society takes that away from children. It steals that from children. There's this famous Picasso poem that every child is born an artist, and it's our duty to see that it remains such. I would like that circle to exist for my students. The freedom that we are talking about comes with great responsibility of self, family, neighborhood, subset, and ultimately for all people in the world. That is what I want for my circle, a full-grown sense of humanity, a lifetime circle. So this idea that wherever his students are, even as alumni, that they are still quoting and citing the kinds of things that he was saying in this class over a decade ago, that now that they are teaching younger siblings, younger cousins, and in some cases their own children, that they need to seek out, be knowledge seekers, that they need to seek out knowledge and information, that they go into these institutions that when they grew up down the street from the Bronx Zoo, they thought the Bronx Zoo was for white people. They didn't think it was for Dominican and Puerto Rican and Black children. They can go to Brooklyn and get on the train and go to the botanical gardens or to the museum, that they're not afraid of these institutions and they understand that they can access these institutions. When I introduced Papa Joe's work to teacher education, I received feedback that emerging teachers believed that Papa Joe was unusual and his practices could not be duplicated. Introducing work in teacher education can be tenuous. One risks his or her ideas being whittled down into something easily digestible and often looking very different than what was intended. McHenry and Heath posit that with the introduction of multicultural education, teachers became overly reliant on quote-unquote cultural logos that explain the ways in which particular students learn. So African-American students, argued McHenry and Heath were often viewed as oral, right? Void of valuing the written word. A cultural historical approach to literacy learning, according to Gutierrez and Rogoff, challenges the usefulness of such logos, or what they call matching strategies, by focusing on the histories and lived experiences that students bring to the classrooms. So what I'd like to do is to show you a little bit about what these spaces look like in the teacher education process. So at UW-Madison, I direct the secondary English program. So we train the middle school and high school English teachers. And currently, I was just explaining this to your dean, currently we're an undergraduate certification program. So you earn your certification on your way to your bachelor's degree. In the fall, 2015, our program will become a master's program. So secondary English, math, social studies, and science will all be master's programs that look a little bit more like what you're accustomed to here. And so in the training of English teachers, I have started to train my teachers in restorative justice practices. So they go through formal training, and then also it's implemented throughout the methods classes so that students really understand how to bring the restorative justice work and their actual curricular tools together, as opposed to these things being separate and distinct. So I believe the model of classroom management is really outdated, and when we have our amazing emerging teachers going out into the world, we're sending them out there with these sort of compartmentalized ideas about, like, here's my field and here's what I'm really good at, and I teach English, I teach literature, I do this. I don't know what to do with this student who's jumping up and down over here, so I'm just gonna send them out. I mean, it's an easy thing to go to because you're not necessarily trained to use the work and use the tools of your trade to keep the children in the seats. So we're really trying in the English education program, the secondary English program, to model this. And that means the supervisors who I hire to do the work, they have to do the work too. They have to sit in on the trainings, and they have to conduct this work even when they're meeting with the cooperating teachers and student teachers. If there are conflict, we model it like a conflict circle. We respond to conflict using restorative justice tools and measures. And while I'm actively resisting building a restorative English education canon, because people say, well, what books do you use for it? I don't want to use a canon, so to speak. There are tools and resources that I do use with pre-service teachers at my institution. And I always consider context and hope to model what I want student teachers to do in their classrooms. Consider the human lives in front of you and invite youth to define themselves and their needs. Circles allow for this kind of fluidity and demonstrate how culture shifts and changes depending on a community's needs. I've started to introduce these circle processes, and so during the first week, I lead our pre-service English teachers through a series of questions. Who are you? Why are you here? Why teach English? Why now? Which you could substitute that with any of your content, social studies, science, math. And later in the semester, we actually grapple with Professor Ihab Hassan's question: is it possible to teach English in a way that people stop killing? Students often ask for more and express a desire for more formal restorative justice training. So now we've instituted the training as part of the methods class. Throughout the first semester, I introduced a restorative English education framework, and I asked pre-service teachers to write critical reflections of their classroom experiences, in which I learned that many viewed the practices of some of their cooperating teachers as problematic in their stance and disposition toward Black and Latino students. I remember one of my white male students who grew up in a very homogenous white Midwestern town sharing with me that the Black students in his classroom were always wrong, according to the cooperating teacher, no matter what they did. Even if they attempted to engage, they were often criticized for their style of engagement. And once I saw that many of my students were willing to enter unfamiliar territory, I am often the first Black instructor who they've had ever in life since preschool. But they're willing to go into this territory to discuss race and class and gender with me, who was often their first Black teacher. And I pushed the boundaries and made racial disparities in a school-prison nexus central to English methods. In spring 2013, I brought Richard Ross's Juvenile Injustice exhibition to UW-Madison. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Richard Ross's work. He's a professor at UC Santa Barbara. If you have a chance to bring his work to UPenn, I highly recommend it. He now has a book and an exhibition called Girls in Justice. But Richard has traveled throughout the United States and visited many of our jails for children, and he has photographed children in these facilities. He also has a series of photographs that are just about isolation, and then other photographs that are just focused on the kinds of contraptions and the things that they use to restrain our children. When we brought the exhibition to UW-Madison, I specifically asked if we could highlight the photos that were taken in detention centers in Wisconsin, because one of the misnomers was that these kinds of things happen in Philadelphia, these kinds of things happen in Oakland, but these things don't happen here. And when we had the journal out for people to sign in, that was a lot of the comments, like, I cannot believe this is happening here. Like, when I looked at the fine print and saw that these pictures were taken in Wisconsin, it was mind-blowing for people. So we brought Richard Ross out to give a talk about his work. And Richard, he's very, sort of imposing, really, really tall guy, and he talks about going into the detention centers, he's white, male, and he always makes sure that when he is meeting with children in the detention centers that he puts himself beneath them. Like, he is either sitting on the floor or crouching or sitting down below. He's usually on the floor because he's so tall and he's so imposing. The children are also involved in staging their photo because obviously they have to protect their identity. But in addition to the photos, he also collects their stories. And he actually has some of these on the Juvenile and Justice website, which I would highly recommend that you look at, and a very active blog that also has the stories of parents whose children are incarcerated. So a lot of times we're thinking about, Vivian just left here, her work has been very influential for me. We think about the children of incarcerated parents, but he's also thinking about the parents of incarcerated children and the struggles that they have and the kinds of ways in which people label them and discriminate against them because something must be wrong with you if your child is in this situation, as opposed to you don't have the resources so that your children are not in this situation. So we brought Richard Ross out, and we also brought out the authors to the Race to Equity, for the Race to Equity report. And we scheduled this event during the methods class, so my students had to come. There was no, like, I have something else to do. No, it's actually during class time, so we're having it here. And I think the kinds of feedback that we received from students, the most powerful thing that people kept saying was that, now that I know, I can't pretend like I don't know. Like, once you know this and you see this, you can't erase it. Like, I can't erase this from my practice or how I'm thinking about my work. So on a clear yet crisp Saturday morning, it's the first time we did this, a group of pre-service English teachers volunteered their time on the weekend for restorative justice training. And our trainer and circle keeper, I'm using pseudonyms, Tia, who worked for a nonprofit organization that offers restorative justice training, helped facilitate the dialogue. Tia was part of a team that won a grant competition to provide restorative justice training to students, teachers, and administrators in a local school district. And she said, we teach young people about circle keeping, but when I began this work, I thought the work was about ending racial disparities in education and schooling using restorative justice. However, the young people we work with taught me that circle keeping is about building community and humanizing people and not just reducing disparities. So it's not just a numbers game, but it's about the human connection, going back to this notion of interrelatedness. This is part of the social emotional curriculum, Tia argued. Tia and I had participated in a 3-day restorative justice circle keeper training together, which provided a foundation for our work together. So we had already been through training together. So she, even though she's not a teacher educator, I told her what my goals were for the secondary English program. Then we coupled that with her skill set as a facilitator, as a trainer, and then we built something together. So once Tia and I did everything we could to make our physical circle in a really awkward room. Some classrooms are not conducive to a circle, and we know that from clunky furniture and desks that are attached to chairs, which are a no-no in restorative justice circles. You have to actually have chairs with no desks. There should be no barriers between you and people. So, these are real things that are really hard for teachers to figure out because they don't necessarily have the space or the furniture to do these things. We came up with a list of guidelines and values that we considered essential for our time together. Words like love, empathy, open-mindedness, patience, engagement, believing in each other, silence, time to reflect, the ability to question were invoked. Positivity was brought into the circle twice, and respect broke the record with 5 appearances. I was just at a restorative justice training with teachers at an elementary school in Richmond, California. And when we were going through the values, what everybody needed to participate in this time together, no one mentioned respect. And the facilitator, she was like, wait a minute, I've been doing this for a decade and the word respect always comes up. And it was really interesting because I was the outsider in the group, right? Because I wasn't a teacher at the school. But I felt like this group there was just some kind of connection there, and that I didn't even feel like I needed to use the word respect or that I needed to bring it up. And it was interesting because all of the teachers, they felt the same way. Like they felt like respect was already in the room, but that facilitator said, it's been 10 years I've been doing this. I've never not had the word respect come up. But what was really interesting is she took us through this exercise of coming up with a respect agreement, because for when you have children in the circle, the word respect always comes up. But we have to decode what respect means, because respect for the children, it means something different to the children than it means to the adults. And then it's also really interesting when we try to break down the word respect with children and teachers together, with students and teachers together. I'm sorry, I use the word children a lot, and the reason why I use children is because I want to always remind us that these are children. Like we say young men and young women, but we are talking about children, and I think sometimes we are propelling them into adulthood before they need to be. So I will say children, and that is out of profound respect for human development and child development. So I hope that you guys understand that. But we really have to try to break down what it means, what respect means. What does respect sound like? What does it look like? How will it feel? Okay, so, but I thought it was really interesting that this group didn't bring up respect. Leah, who worked with Tia in the Restorative Justice Program in schools, explained, I don't often bring respect into the place because others do, as you can see. So I brought it today because I was at a middle school and a circle participant used the word, but then did something that I would consider disrespectful. So respect has to mean something, thus the respect agreement, trying to break down what it means. Tia had recently been tapped to do some work with the school district in revising its code of conduct for students. And in one of the first tenets in the draft of the new code, according to Tia, there was a long statement along the lines of respect others the way you want to be respected or treated. And later, one of the tenants read something like understanding where people come from and respecting their differences. And she threw her hands up and said, how do you do this? What is this? I mean, it's so vague, like we don't know what that means. We have to break it down. So the first thing that happens in the circle is the introduction of the talking piece, the talking bowl, the values, and then you'll also see these photos or these pictures that students did. I'll talk about those a little bit later. So the talking piece is probably the most important instrument, and teachers do a lot of things like this in the classroom. We shouldn't undermine that educators aren't doing this in some sort of way. I've heard in a lot of the schools something called one mic, where it's this, and it's not an actual microphone, but it's the idea that the person who's talking is the only one who's doing the talking. In the circles, I think what's really important, Kay Pranis, who's really instrumental in helping us thinking about circle processes, these are not a neutral space. They're not value-free. They're full of values. It's important to have values. And so you start off with what are the things that everybody here needs to be able to be in a space together. And the talking piece is the thing that reminds you to not just be thinking about what you want to say next, but you will get your turn, but you're actually focused on the person who has the talking piece. And it's really interesting in the study that I'm completing that all of the students keep talking about the importance of the talking piece and how they really respect having this tool, like this physical reminder that you don't have to just say what you think all the time, that you will get a chance and you will get a turn. So even in the absence of a talking piece, they are finding themselves thinking about a talking piece, and in regular conversations and dialogue with people, they're actually using that value of listening that they would learn with actually holding the physical talking piece. So it's a physical tool, it's also symbolic, and can also be very psychological. And so we put the values around in the circle. This is the centerpiece of the circle. And then we also spend a little bit of time looking at the guidelines. So the guidelines are also things that the group come up with. And every group is going to be different, but I thought some of these were so funny because I had never heard this. Don't yuck someone's yum. Have you ever heard that? That's so great. I've actually been telling my 4-year-old this because, you know, he'll look at my food like, yeah, ew, what is that? So don't yuck someone's yum, or an ouch, oops, like if someone says something and it wasn't malicious, we're assuming that there's no malicious intent, right? Ouch, that kind of hurt, or oops, that felt, you know, I felt some kind of way about that. Also, step up or step down, like you're going into an area that is a little tricky. Why don't you step down from that a little bit? But also to think about people who may have disabilities in terms of stepping up, stepping down. They have move up or move back. So these were things that were new to me in terms of guidelines, and something different comes up in every space. But it's really important to spend time with this, and these actually take a really long time. And the exercise that I did recently with the team of teachers in Richmond, or was participating in, the respect agreement, it took a really long time. But I love this beautiful illustration that Sujatha has of a teacher who she worked with who said, I don't have time to do this. Like, who has time to do this? And now this teacher does the restorative justice work, and she says, I don't have time not to do it. It saves me so much time on the back end. I have to do this work up front. It seems like it's taking a long time, but we do it to build community. And I certainly feel that way as the methods teacher. You meet once a week for 3 hours, and I spend at least the first 2 weeks, which is almost like the first month, right, by the time school starts, doing this work. But it saves us time on the back end, and it really is important to start in these places. So I try to model that. I don't try to model that, I do model that. So we do this work up front. It does take a lot of time. So in this particular case, and this activity was Tia's idea, it was not my idea. She asked our pre-service teachers to draw an illustration that demonstrated their best teaching selves. And she shared her own picture with a profile, words flowing out of the person's mouth while declaring, my best self would be able to decode the language of school and be focused. But this has not happened yet. She's a graduate student. And she talked about and opened up about learning disabilities, having learning disabilities. And when she started that conversation, other pre-service teachers in the circle talked about having learning disabilities and not wanting to inform me or my colleagues that they had learning disabilities because they thought, if I'm going to be a teacher, I'm not supposed to have learning disabilities. So the circle work is about the work we're going to do with the students, but to be honest with you, it's the work that we need to do for ourselves, because these were students who would not even come to me. As much as I'd like to think that I was open and welcoming, they were afraid to tell me that they needed accommodations because it was a teacher prep program. And so that was really stunning for me. The other thing that came out in this space, and this is, I think, particularly interesting for male English teachers, is this notion of the feminization of teaching English. So one of the things that I also didn't realize is that some of our male candidates were dealing with peer pressure from friends as well as pressure from family to not be an English teacher. Parents saying things like, parents saying things like, you're wasting my money, you know, why aren't you going to be an engineer? Or another student teacher talking about all of his friends were getting jobs at places like Google, and they were just like, you're going to teach? And so the circle became a space to explore this notion of teaching and masculinities. And again, something that I would not have been privy to, something that would not have, it would have been hard to invoke just in a regular sort of lecture style or even methods seminar class. But because of the ways that we ask the question, when we ask who are you at your best student self, the male teachers said their best selves were in this space where people understood why they wanted to teach and why they wanted to teach English. That was when they were at their best, because they didn't have to pretend like this wasn't their passion, and they weren't around people who questioned this passion. So those were some of the things that came out as well. And in a final round of the Restorative English Education Circle, I asked students to share a piece of literature that's influenced them and that they hope to share with young people. It's so funny, the first time that I did this, I used the wrong words. I said something like, oh, I don't know, I just said bring, you know, your favorite piece of literature. I don't even know what I said. It was just not the right wording. And so because we were all English teachers, everybody felt really compelled to bring something that was part of the canon. But then there were like 3 or 4 people who brought, one brought their grandmother's Bible. Someone brought a collection of their own poetry. Someone brought some of the poems that they texted to a friend on their phone, put their phone in the middle, because everybody puts their readings in the middle. So then everybody who brought the traditional canon text wanted a do-over. They were all mad. They were like, wait, I thought you said to just bring, and I said, I didn't say what literature, I just said, you know, I said, oh no, I said, what literature would you like to teach, or something like that. And so they all thought that they should bring like this canon, these canonical texts. So then we got to do this over the right way, and I said, bring a piece of literature that you would love to put in the hands of a young person. And remember that literature is broadly construed. So we can say poetry, we can say music, we can say letters. So I had to actually make that explicit in my invitation so that they didn't feel like it had to be this, acceptable form of literature. So again, I'm thinking that people are reading me in a particular way, and I'm having to remember that even in my own practice, just in the way that I'm encouraging them as teachers to keep being explicit and to keep having these invitations to their students, I have to do the same thing. I have to do the same thing in my own practice. And in this final round, we shared the text, and I think it's really interesting. One text that I always say I'm not going to use it again, but I love using it and students love it, is A House on Mango Street. And I only say that because I've used it so much, but there's just so much you can do with that text. I think we all know that, whoever, any of us who've ever taught English, we love Sandra Cisneros. So every time I say I'm going to do something different, I still have it. And then the other text that a student brought in was Our America, Life and Death on the South Side of Chicago. And so we closed the circle with, they wanted to share quotes from these texts, so I want to share the quotes that they shared. And so from Our America, which the journalist who wrote this book also co-authored it with some of the young people who were part of the project. And so the quote is, "I know you don't want to hear about the kids getting shot in that part of the city. But little do you know that that part of the city is your part of the city too. This is our neighborhood, this is our city, and this is our America. And we must somehow find a way to help each other. We must come together no matter what you believe in, no matter how you look, and we must find some concrete solutions to the problem of the ghetto." And then the last quote was from Sandra Cisneros' House on Mango Street from For Skinny Trees vignette. "When I am too sad and too skinny to keep keeping, when I am a tiny thing against so many bricks, then it is I look at trees. And when there is nothing left to look at on this street, four who grew despite concrete, four who reach and do not forget to reach, four whose only reason is to be and be." Sandra Cisneros. So where do we go from here, and what is the work? A national spotlight on racial disparities in school discipline and practices has demonstrated that a plan of action is needed, so we know that much. Restorative practices are one way to address this. However, I do need to acknowledge the limitations of restorative justice if an entire school community or a majority of that community has not received adequate training and subsequent support in implementation. Training takes time. I was just talking to your dean about this. Training should at least be 4 full days. Yeah, I know, 4 full days devoted to circle keeper trainings, and teachers, administrators, non-certified staff persons need to be compensated for their time. It's a lot of time. However, a restorative justice mindset for teachers is something that I believe can be cultivated in teacher education and with pre-service teachers as they learn their craft. So I feel like one way to deal with the notion that training and pulling people out is going to be really hard is that we can do some of this work when our teachers are with us learning their trade. This restorative justice mindset does not simply acknowledge differences, cultures, and histories. Teachers go further by using what I call their curricular powers to curate spaces in their curriculum and engagement in which they, along with their students, exchange important narratives that provide context for complex, fluid, and important lives. I'll take some questions. Thank you. Yes. Hi.
You're going to be in a 1-year teacher education program at Wisconsin.
Yes, so it's much like the program that I had in Emory.
But how, knowing the craziness that's out there in policy circles and in state legislatures and so forth, and we've got this latest fetish called Common Core Standards. You've got to prepare English teachers in 1 year to go do something that could, if it follows the previous trajectory, could become all-encompassing and simply take over their lives, which is we've got to meet these standards. I understand how all this can be effectively integrated, but I would worry that the reality of the thing is that this kind of activity is going to get quashed in the deluge as a mixed matter.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm underscoring the fact that it has to be integrated into the actual work. So
Yeah.
I'm not talking about substituting time that we're taking from teaching pre-service teachers how to teach the persuasive essay or very specific things that we know, at least for English, that we know that we have to do that are part of Common Core or whatever it is that we're following at the time. So this is not in lieu of that, but we do this, it coincides with this.
No, I understand your
Yeah.
structuring of it.
Mhm.
I'm worried about what happens when
When they're actually
these
in
things
the-
actually go into classrooms and they're being hit with value added. And we know this thing is going to be test driven. And the details, the devil's going to be in the details. It may come apart quite quickly. Implementation is the big enchilada there, and it anyway, I won't throw any more bad metaphors into this.
No, it's okay.
I really,
struggling.
what you're trying to do here is create a strong positive ethos in a school that you've got to have that. But before you can do these other things, but the reality is state legislators and governors and policymakers don't get it.
Yeah. So what it looks like in real time in terms of in a school community, I'll just give you sort of a best scenario with one of the teachers in the case study that I'm doing, an English teacher. Prior to school starting, she went through 125 files of students. She looked at who received referrals for what. She tried to get a sense of the kinds of conflict that students were having with teachers. Obviously, referrals were from one perspective, but she did this work before she actually met her students. She also knew that a new code of conduct was going to be introduced that was going to discourage teachers from pushing students out. So we weren't going to be able to send out kids for a lot of the things that teachers typically send kids out. So this is what they're dealing with. Like, you've got the kids, you've typically been able to send students out for things that can be very subjective. You feel like you've been disrespected, you send them out. You feel like something happened, you send them out. So she adjusted herself to understand that under no circumstances can I send a child out of this class, unless it is something, it has to be something like obviously really big. So she had a sense of what some of the conflict the students had who were coming into her classroom. She literally and figuratively met her students at the door, particularly students who might have had a fuller file than others with referrals or issues. She already had activities in place where those students would be facilitators or support in leading particular parts of the class. She's still doing all the things that she's supposed to do, all the things that she's mandated to do, all the materials that she's expected to cover, but she has already thought about who might need her support and that she is not going to rely on sending someone to a hall monitor. Then she has taken some of her materials that she feels are adequate for circles, so things that students have to read and read together, and they actually read these materials, they might be short readings, together in circle, and they interrogate or discuss them in this using this framework. And then when she needs a circle for when there's an actual harm or when there's an issue, they're familiar with the process because they've used the circle process also with their academic work. They've used it when they're reading and interrogating text. So it's really a structure that her students are familiar with, and she can use the tool, whether it's for something that has to do with Common Core, or if it's for something that's really trying to deal with a problem that is disrupting learning, because the disrupting of learning is happening no matter what. So whatever state people, politicians, teachers in their classroom are dealing with disruptions. And they're handling it obviously differently, but they have to address those disruptions because all of the classroom teachers I know are receiving a lot of pressure to not suspend, in-school suspensions, out-school suspensions, but they're not necessarily being given tools to support ongoing learning in the classrooms in spite of the fact that these conflicts are still happening. So just because this code changed doesn't mean that the behaviors have changed. The behaviors are still there, but the response to the behaviors have to be different, but they're not necessarily getting any support to change their response. So I say all this to say that they have to have a way to deal with this so that they're not spending half of the class time with an issue. So not able to get to any of the things you're talking about.
No, I fully
Yeah,
agree.
right?
I just worry that we're going to lose a lot of these young teachers
Yeah.
because they've got to build this infrastructure, if you want to call it
Right.
that. They've got to do that because you can't do the other thing. But there's a 3-year mentality. If it's not done in 3 years, you're in somebody's doghouse.
Right. I think that's very true. We're certainly
Yeah,
feeling
raise
the
your hand.
pressure in the state.
Stop me
I just want to
talking.
make sure no one else. Thank you for the
Hi.
Thank you for that. To me, was really one of the most enlightening talks I've heard in my career as an educator. I just thought it was phenomenal, and it was really inspiring for me to see how your ideas have you're returning to old data, but with this new framework, and how your mind of inquiry has deepened.
I didn't have the language.
You know, one question I have is, in the circles and in restorative justice, what role does like structural violence, play? How does that come up within these contexts? So I can see, and I really love that it's classroom centered and with students. So I can see a student has an incident where there's harm, right? But what about the other kinds of harm that are more invisible? Like even like a teacher, I remember, for example, giving a high stakes test to a first grader who was a language learner. And that's a type of harm, right? That's a type of
Yes,
symbolic violence.
absolutely.
And I wonder if these structural types of violence, because I wonder about the ways in which kind of like individual behavior, even though it's framed differently, right? And the remedy's different. I get back to that lovely quote about interrelatedness,
Yeah.
So how do we not reproduce the idea that it's the individual causing harm, and how do we get at this other kind of deeper systemic level?
Thank you so much for that. So as part of my fellowship, I'm rereading all of the restorative justice theory, and now it means something completely different to me than it did, 5 years ago when I started reading this stuff. I mean, it's completely different because I'm actually working with practitioners who work in a criminal and juvenile justice context. I mean, to attorneys who've worked, on death row cases. I mean, a very different context. But one of the things that is really striking to me when I'm rereading people like Howard Zehr is, as I'm reading about the notion of being a victim and who's been harmed, one of the things that I think all of us really understand is a lot of the people who cause harm in schools have been harmed on so many different levels. And so the thing that I'm struggling with right now is how to think about the harm that you're talking about, the structural violence that young people have experienced in schools and outside of schools, and how it plays out in the school context, and how we address that as we are addressing the needs of the person who has been immediately harmed, where it's more visible, like this is the quote unquote victim. This person right here who you pushed, this person right here who you threw the chair at, this teacher right here who you slammed the door in his or her face, So there's layers of this harm. And so as I'm revisiting like Changing Lenses and even like the little book on restorative justice, the thing that keeps coming back is that you have to address the needs of not only the person who has been harmed, but the person who has caused harm. And there is, in the theory of restorative justice, a very important space for, obviously in criminal justice terms, it's the offender, but the person who causes harm. You are supposed to address that person's need too, so that they can be reintegrated into the space. So it's not, we keep isolating you, we keep kicking you out of here, we keep you over there, so you never ever really learn how to engage in behaviors that are socially appropriate because you keep getting pushed out, you keep getting increasingly more angry and not respecting the space because you don't feel like the space respects you. And so I think that that's what I find really powerful about what's sort of happening in Northern California and the Bay Area in particular is there are community institutions that are working with schools, that are working with people in psychological health, who are working with healthcare, like they're trying to make sure all the bases are covered. And see, when I was doing the work with Girl Time, as a critical literacy scholar, my focus was thinking about the ways in which the act of this playwriting and playmaking was giving girls an opportunity to sort of write themselves out of these labels, right? But the thing that I wasn't accounting for was all of the other kinds of needs they would have. Like why this program was so important and so powerful for them that they were still leaving the day's activities and going to places that were not safe for them. Not necessarily knowing where they were going to sleep, not knowing who was going to watch their kids, or like showing up to the program with their kids because they did not have a reliable childcare situation. So we had to step back and say, wait a minute, there are lots of services needed here. We can't, the literacy and the art, amazing, we're all about that, but we don't know about these other spaces. We have to address these other spaces. And so what's really interesting to me too is the ways in which the social workers at the schools and the school psychologists in the implementation of the restorative justice work at the schools are really pushing for schools to think about this component that would encompass all of those spaces, the psychological health services, the physical health and well-being, in addition to, you know, all of the different things that our children need. Like they need these resources or some sort of access to these resources as part of the school piece. But I really think the support circles, which are the circles for one singular student, they're not about a conflict. Those are the circles where we address some of the symbolic violence and the systematic violence against particular students. So when we see that a student is struggling or that we're getting to a place that could explode at some point, those support circles are intended to get in front of that, okay? And then we can sort of peel back the layers and try to understand what this young person is experiencing and how different people in the building and outside of the building could potentially support them. I would also invite you to, so Our Joy, or Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, they have a couple of really great videos, like short films on their website, and I think they're probably on YouTube as well, where they show an actual support circle with a student. Again, there's not a conflict, there's not like this outright event that we can name, but you can see that how over time the student has become disengaged in school, and everybody in the circle is trying to figure out how they can bring them back into the circle. So it's mothers in there, a stepfather, the community person, people from the school, the principal comes to the circle, like everyone is in there trying to figure out how do we try to address the miseducation and the mistreatment that has led to the current behaviors.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for the talk.
Thank you.
A few of the things you said makes me wonder about the role conflict plays in restorative justice and the space allowed for conflict. I was a teacher, and now I'm conducting my research in an alternative high school in Philly for 18 to 21-year-olds, and they are, for over a decade, have been implementing restorative justice with hurdles and ups and downs as it goes. And a recent iteration makes me really scared for the process that they're kind of appropriating in the way that they're equating it as an attempt for a conflict-free zone or a confrontation-free zone. And respectfully, your word peaceably, I'm fearful about those characterizations of restorative justice because as an English teacher, I found conflict such a powerful tool in my classroom. I don't want to be scared of it. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to how do we teach restorative justice as not a conflict-free, a showing anger is bad, a don't confront one another in this like angry, that all-encompassing term for many of our youth, even teachers, like where are spaces of conflict possible and beneficial within a restorative justice model?
And see, this for me is why this time that I've been spending with these practitioners has been so important, because I feel as if any of us can become so dangerously close to not really showing fidelity to things that we import into education, right? And so that's why it's been really important for me to spend this time thinking about restorative justice in spaces in which it initially played out, at least in terms of the U.S. American culture, which is the criminal justice system. And so this notion that conflict is not, I love Ronald K. Porter and Zeus Leonardo have this amazing piece that, turns this notion of safe space upside down on its head, and they argue that, this thing doesn't exist, right? This notion of a safe space. And I agree with you because one of the things that I've been sort of highlighting Even in some of the writings around restorative justice, is I keep seeing the word safe space, and I'm like, no, you need to see Porter and Leonardo, there's no such thing. Even in spaces that we think are supposed to be safe, they're not. Because, and I tell my students this all the time, I cannot guarantee this is safe, because I can't control what comes out of other people's mouths. Now what I can do is I can sort of mitigate it, and I can facilitate, and I can, bring us into a conversation when someone is uncomfortable, but I cannot promise you that this person is not going to say something that's going to offend you, or that even that I won't say something. I will say that if you bring it to my attention, we will have a conversation about it. We can deal with it. Like, I'm open to dealing with it. So I think that this is the problem of importing. And if people are not receiving adequate training, which they're not, because again, it's just one more thing is being plopped. And administrators have a different goal than the teachers have and than the students have. I mean, they're trying to get those numbers down, because right now it's, not PC to have all the black students in your school, or all the students who are getting suspended are all black and all Latino. Like, that's not okay anymore. People have raised this to a national level in terms of attention, and people are on it. So they're trying to reduce those numbers. But by reducing those numbers, if you just introduce stuff or put a Band-Aid on and you're not dealing with core relationships, it just doesn't really matter. So I think in terms of how I'm hoping to address it is I actually like to use the circle work for things that I think would bring up conflict, things that would bring up debate. So when I use the teacher as a case study who is using articles or reading materials in circles, a lot of the materials that she will bring are things that students will debate about that they don't necessarily agree on. So when they're passing the talking piece, they are practicing, in persuasive ways, talking about what they think or their reaction to whatever this issue is that is taking place in the reading. So it's not, so they learn right away that in this circle structure that you don't all have to agree. And I think that that's really powerful. That's why I think it's important to use this structure, not just for cases that are involving harm, but also to use it as part of one of your academic tools. And so I think when students see that, then they know they can still be angry. The other thing I think is happening is that people are associating restorative justice with forgiveness. And restorative justice is not supposed to be about forgiveness. It's actually not really the core tenet of restorative justice. The person who's been harmed does not have to forgive anybody. Forgiveness should not be on the burden of the person who has experienced harm. That's a lot to expect from someone. The consensus building doesn't mean you get there without conflict. It just means that we have to decide how are we going to respond to it. It doesn't mean that we leave here and we all love each other and hold hands when we leave, but it means that we have decided, I think this is a way for you to be held accountable. I would feel better about what happened. I can move on. I can see you in the hallway and not feel like I want to fight you, because I know that we have talked about this here and we've dealt with it in this space.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I have really bad news. We are out of time. I can sense the temperature in the room that we actually could continue on with a really important conversation with Professor Winn, but we're out of time. I would be remiss if I didn't take just a moment to acknowledge Dr. Jessie Harper. She's the better of the two Dr. Harpers in our school. So Jessie is our Assistant Dean for Faculty Affairs and Diversity. That's the role in which most of us know her best. But Jessie is actually a real scholar on many of the issues that Maisha just talked about. Her own research has been on juvenile justice and on the school to prison pipeline and restorative justice and so on. So it really was, in fact, Jessie last summer who brought Maisha to the table as a must-have person for this year's Scholars of Color series. So Jessie, thank you for bringing Maisha to the table as a nominee. Now, you don't have to be an assistant dean to bring nominees to the table. The process is very, very simple for the series. If there is someone that you are interested in having come to be a part of our community, send an email to Jessie, Dean Pam Grossman, and or me, and that's all we need, really. We just need a name and maybe where the person works, and we'll go and find the person and do all the intel and have a really important summer meeting in which we put together this slate. It's really as simple as that. You don't have to write a formal letter of nomination or anything like that. So if there is someone whose face you would like to see on a poster as a part of this important series, do let us know. Speaking of the posters, so I mentioned that this series has been around for more than 25 years. It started at Michigan State. It was created by our former dean, Andy Porter, when he was a professor there, and he took it with him to University of Wisconsin-Madison, where it still lives, and onward to Vanderbilt, and then here. One very ceremonial part of the series over time has been the advertising of the talk via a poster. So we framed the poster and present it at the end of the talk to the visiting scholars.
That is so nice.
Thank you.
So classy.
So
Classy. I wouldn't expect anything less. Thank you guys so much.
Here's where it gets even classier.
Oh.
We won't make you take this on the plane.
I
We will
heard.
mail it to you.
I'm like, this is so great. How am I going to carry it?
But thank
Thank
you,
you.
Maisha, for being our guest and for
Thank you
sharing
so
your
much.
work. And thank you all
Oh, I
for
get to see
coming.
some of you at the lunch with students, right? I'm going to
Yep.
see some people. Okay, great. Bye. Thank you.